a brief presentation for this open house. We're going to do one at the beginning of this session and then one at the beginning of the next session as well. So if I can get everybody's attention. Okay, so this open house is at the, we're in the environmental assessment phase of the project. So this open house is the open house associated with the first round of consultation of the environmental assessment phase for the project. So what we're going to do is we're going to run through a few different topics today, just to give you an idea of where we are and where we're going. And we won't get overly technical, but if you have any technical questions, I don't want to talk for too long because people lose interest, but if you have any questions, please come by and ask us afterwards and we'll be happy. We're here till 9 o'clock tonight, so we got lots of time to answer your questions, and I'll do my best to get through this in a reasonable amount of time. So today what we're going to do is we're going to just do an overview of the environmental assessment, which is the provincial process, and the impact assessment, which is the federal process. So we're going to run through just a brief overview of that. We're not going to bore you with too many details on the process, but we'll go through that. We're going to talk about and this is an important section, on what we've heard from communities. We've received a lot of comments from communities on this project during the terms of reference phase and throughout the entire project to this date as well. We're going to talk about the study plans that have been prepared as part of this work. We're going to talk about the assessment approach that's being undertaken, the Indigenous Knowledge Program, talk a bit about the alternatives and the consideration of those alternatives and how we evaluate those alternatives as well. And then finally, we're going to talk about the various ways that we communicate with communities and the general public. So our consultation approach and then next steps. So this probably isn't necessary, but just to give you an idea of where the project is located, the project runs from the actual settlement part of the community on the Webikwe First Nation Reserve. It runs east and then southeast towards the Ring of Fire area, McFalls Lake area, where it terminates. And for those of you not familiar with where Webikwe is, it's about the same distance from Hudson Bay as it is from James Bay, just to give you an idea, probably a little further from James Bay than Hudson Bay, but that gives you an idea of where it is. Now the purpose of this road, there's three main purposes of this road. The first is to move materials, supplies, and people from the airport in Webikwe to the McFalls Lake area, which is in the Ring of Fire area. And then, of course, another key purpose is to provide employment and economic development opportunities to the First Nation while allowing them to stay in their community and preserve their language and culture, which is extremely important. And then finally, on the employment and training side, it's to provide that important experience and training opportunities for youth and to encourage them to pursue additional skills and education through post-secondary education. So just to give you an idea of the project itself, the planned road is 107 kilometers in length. It's 17 of those kilometers sit within the actual reserve boundaries. At this point, we do not have a defined center line for the road. We have a 2-kilometer corridor for the road right now, a preliminary corridor that we're using for looking at route alternatives. And then the final corridor width would be 35 meters so for a 2-lane gravel road and in shoulders as well. There are three main major water body crossings, the Winisk Lake, which is the biggest one, Winiskis Channel, and the Mukatai River right near the end of the road, at the east end of the road. And the project itself, a lot of people don't realize this, but it's more than just a road. It's both permanent and temporary facilities associated with the road. So that could include construction camps, which are temporary, and then offices, other supportive facilities associated with the camps might be wastewater plants and water storage plants for drinking water as well too. And then of course there's gravel pits and quarries, the access roads to these facilities. There's storage and laydown yards, which are temporary in general during the construction of the project, and then there may be one or two facilities for storing equipment and for maintenance purposes along the route. So let's go through a little bit of a process overview. I know this looks quite complicated, but what we've got here is we've got three processes on the screen here. So we've got the federal impact assessment process, we have the provincial environmental assessment process, and then Webequie has their own process, and I think the chief was talking about this earlier. Webequie goes through their own decision-making process for this project, in addition to these other processes, and they are in the process of doing that right now, evaluating the project based on their principles. And in the federal process right now, the federal and provincial process, we are right now completing the baseline field data collection and starting to put all that information together, and shortly we'll begin looking at potential impacts based on the information we collect. So right now, as it says here, we're conducting studies, finishing those studies, consulting, preparing that environmental assessment report or impact statement. The environmental assessment report is the provincial document. The impact statement is the federal document. And those are all done in accordance with the scope that's set out, which is called the terms of reference for the provincial side. And then on the federal side, they're called the tailored impact statement guidelines. So, as much as it can be, these two processes, the federal process and the provincial process, are coordinated. It's not perfect. One document is submitted at the end. That's probably the highest point of coordination, where you have a single document that is meant to satisfy both of those regulatory bodies. And so along the way, both the provincial and federal governments meet on a regular basis to try to keep their timelines sort of roughly aligned. So there is quite a bit of coordination, even though there are two separate processes. In terms of engagement and consultation to date, we had a long terms of reference phase, which was the phase of preparing the work plan for the provincial environmental assessment. It was over 3 years, 2019 to 2021. COVID was in there as well, which slowed things down, obviously. And during that period of time, we created the project website. We visited many communities. And then when COVID hit, and I think Michael talked about this a bit earlier in the media scrum, we changed gears in terms of the way that we consult with communities, because we had to. So we started looking at different approaches like streaming and radio shows to interact with community members and get their feedback as well too. So we've done that. We've distributed notices. We send out regular emails. We're doing a lot of things on social media that weren't done before in terms of trying to attract interest on the project, which I think has worked out pretty well. You know, when we have events like this, we live stream these events. this right now is being live streamed, and we keep track of the information in terms of how many people are looking at it, and because it's important to show the effort that we've made in trying to get the messages out as well. So we're hopefully back to in-person meetings soon, which is always better to get out to the communities and hear directly from people. So we'll be doing that again very shortly. We've just started to do that in the last few weeks, or this summer. So we've heard from a number of different First Nations from all over the region about this project. And it's been great. It's been very helpful. Now, just so everyone knows, when we have something called the terms of reference, the work plan, which is the provincial work plan for the environmental assessment, there's a process that has to be followed where it's distributed, and then communities and their members can review it and provide feedback, provide comments on it, on the terms of reference, on that work plan. And so we have received, I would say, well over 500 comments on this project in each of, I believe, 2 or 3 rounds of review. And we're, as the technical team for the project, our job is to respond to these comments. So we respond to these comments and then provide them back to the province, and the province reviews it to assess whether we've addressed the comment. So we got a wide range of comments over the last 3 years or 2.5 years. And there's a number of key themes that I thought I would just run through. One of the top ones, of course, is Aboriginal and treaty rights and interests, protecting and assessing impacts on traditional way of life. That's a big one. We get a lot of comments on that, understandably. Another area where we've gotten a lot of comments is on cumulative effects or cumulative impacts. And what I mean by that is not just looking at the Webequie Supply Road project, but looking at all the other projects that are current or planned or even started a long time ago and may have finished. Looking at the impact of all of those together, the big picture view. And so we've gotten a lot of comments on that. We've gotten comments from communities on ensuring we follow, when we consult with them, that we follow proper protocols of those communities, which is, of course, exactly what we want to do. When we meet with communities, we ask them, do you have protocols that you want us to follow? And we always try to adhere to those as wherever possible. And then on the environmental assessment, on the impact assessment side, on the more technical side, I guess, we get into things, discussions, comments about the EA process, some good comments, some bad comments about it. The Crown's duty to consult is another big one. Looking at alternatives, so identifying alternatives in the process of reviewing and assessing those alternatives. We get comments on locations of supportive infrastructure like gravel pits and quarries as well too. We get comments about people concerned about certain potential effects, such as in the peatlands, because 65 kilometers of the Webequie Supply Road runs through the muskeg. These are very sensitive areas. They have to be handled properly, and we have to what you call mitigate, which is limit impacts in those areas of the road. So we're glad we get those comments because it highlights how sensitive they are and how important they are. So we get a lot of comments on that. Another area where we've received comments is participation and capacity funding. So of course, many communities don't have the resources to be able to review a lot of these technical documents. So the province has made available funds to help them hire the resources or get the resources so that they can go through these documents and respond to what our project produces and comment on it. So we've received a lot of comments on the participation or capacity funding. Another area which is always of interest to communities is ownership and maintenance operations of the road. Community members will say, well, is this going to be owned by the province? Is everyone going to be able to come up here and use these roads and come into our territory? And you know, these are all important questions, and there aren't answers to those yet. I think that kind of discussion is just starting, I think, at this point, but we get a lot of comments on that as well. Socioeconomic impacts is a significant concern. Looking at potential impacts of a road connected, you know, that might bring in bad things from the south, and trying to make sure that there are safeguards in place to prevent impacts, socioeconomic impacts. Another big one is climate change and greenhouse gas emissions. Of course, we all see every day the impacts of climate change, and you know, in the design of the road, all those are considered, especially in an area where there's so much water. There's just so much sensitivity. So these are all things, and that ties in again with the peatlands as well too. Water quality, of course, is always a concern for community members for obvious reasons. And so we've spent a lot of time there. There has often been a perception in communities that, you know, in an exercise like an environmental assessment, there isn't a lot of study done on water, but there's quite a bit, groundwater, surface water, and there's more now than ever before in environmental assessments. And then, of course, wildlife and plants, impacts on wildlife and plants, which would then impact traditional activities as well too. So lots of different kinds of comments, which are really helpful, because all those comments help shape the work plan for the environmental assessment. So it's made it to be a really comprehensive exercise. So then we have what we call study plans, and the study plans are a requirement of or were originally a requirement of the federal government in their process. And what they are is a more detailed work plan that explain exactly how we're going to conduct the work. So what studies we're going to do, how we're going to do it, what methods we're going to use. So we have study plans, as you can see on the screen here, for lots of different topics, from geology, terrain and soils, to noise and acoustic, to visual environment, cumulative effects. There's virtually every topic has a study plan associated with it, which describes exactly, it's almost like the recipe for the field work that's going to be done. In terms of the assessment approach, how the work is actually done, we have to talk about valued components, and valued components are, I'll take this right off the screen here, the environmental, health, social, economic, or additional elements or conditions of the natural and human environment that might be affected. So the way I like to describe this to make it easier for people to understand is, at a community level, it's what's important to community members. Is it water? Is it wildlife? Is it security of the community? Not having people coming in from the south without any kind of controls. The things that are important to community members, the general public, those are what valued components are. And so just to, as you can see on the slide here, just to give you an idea, you've got things like surface water, groundwater, air quality, things like built heritage. So that any structures that are part of the cultural heritage of the community, sacred hills, you know, burial places, all that stuff, all that makes up valued components. What's important to community members? So there's valued components, and then there's indicators, and indicators are the way of measuring impacts. So you got to have a way to measure impacts. So it's a way you measure possible effects to be used to assess and evaluate alternative routes. So you have two different routes. They have valued components, or things that are important to community members, and then you have these indicators, which are the ways you can measure impacts. So that's what indicators are. So I'm now talking in environmental assessment language, valued components and indicators. That's environmental assessment language. And then you have to define boundaries for all of this too. So they define the boundaries of potential effects of the project. And so they define sort of the study area for the work. And they change. These change depending on the valued component. Now we have general boundaries, just to get as a guide, but still depending on what, like caribou, study areas for caribou are different from the study areas for water, for example. So but there are three general ones, and the first one is the actual project footprint. So if you think of the road and anything that's required for the road, whether it's a gravel pit or a road to get to the gravel pit, that's the footprint of the project. So that's one study area, generally. The next study would be the local study area. So they take that footprint, and they add what you call a buffer, which is the distance outside of that footprint. So if we say 1 kilometer, it's 1 kilometer on either side of the project footprint. So that would be a sample local study area. And then a regional study area is much broader, right? Now, again, this changes for each valued component. So for caribou, the regional study area is huge area, much bigger area, because the caribou travel over large areas. Some species travel over large areas. So their regional study area is much bigger. And on your screen now is just an image showing the local and regional study areas and the project footprint. So study areas for valued components, I talked a bit about this before. They can change depending on the valued component. To finalize these study areas, we talk to community members to understand, more about each valued component. And then, that depends on how much communities are willing to share with us, and that's where we get into Indigenous knowledge. And then, Indigenous knowledge is a key component in helping us to determine these study areas. And so that's generally how those study areas are defined for the valued components. So that's space. So that's land or water in terms of defining the boundaries, the study area boundaries. But there's also time. So temporal means time. So temporal assessment boundaries is what time frame are you doing the assessment over. So there's two basic time frames. The first is 3 to 6 years, which would be the construction phase of the project, the estimated construction phase of the project. So that's one assessment boundary. And then there's the operations phase. What is the reasonable expected lifespan of the road? So typically, for a road like this, I think it's an MTO standard, they say 75 years. Now this road will probably, if it is built, stay around forever, but they have to choose a number, a reasonable, like a lifespan. So in this case, it's 75 years for the operations phase. So that's what the time or temporal assessment boundaries talk about. So next we move to what you call baseline studies. And the best way to describe baseline studies is all the different environmental studies, because remember, an environmental assessment has many, many compartments within it, many studies within a larger study. And all those studies have to be, in order to be able to identify impacts, which is the purpose, to identify and evaluate impacts of a project. In order to do that, you have to know the way things are now. You have to understand existing conditions. So that's why you have to do these baseline studies. The baseline studies give you something to compare to. So as I mentioned here, they establish existing conditions and they identify the condition in the environment right now. And let's see, they provide, another comment here, they provide a snapshot. They take a picture of the way things are now. So the way things are now, it's pristine natural environment. You add a road to that, and then you have to evaluate. But you have to capture the way things are now in order to be able to compare or predict what the impacts might be of the project. So we've been busy doing these studies. These studies are winding down. We've done studies on so many different areas. We've done noise studies, we've done wildlife studies, pretty incredible things. We've done groundwater studies, surface water studies, fisheries studies, a lot of different studies. And that has given us a very good idea, together with talking to the community and working with the community, getting that picture of the way things are now so we can predict things going forward. So those studies go under three basic categories: natural or biophysical, so you're talking plants, vegetation, wildlife, fish and fish habitats; species at risk, which are certain species that are designated by government agencies as being of importance, like sturgeon, for example; air quality, climate change, noise and vibration, all these things. Some people don't always think of these as being part of an environmental assessment, but they are, because they're part of the environment. Noise and visual environment too, visual impacts, that's part of it as well. Surface water, groundwater, geology, terrain, soils. Then there's the people side of things, the socioeconomic baseline studies. So looking at the community and the composition of the community, the age groups, education levels, employment levels, and what infrastructure is available to the community itself. And how is that infrastructure performing? Are people not getting access to medical services, to dental services, things like that? We've got to paint that picture. We have to capture that, because if we don't know that, we can't identify possible impacts. And then on the cultural side, you have the archaeological resources side, you've got the built heritage side. And most of this information comes from community members knowing, because these are their homeland. It's their homeland. And so we have to talk to community members to identify the significant areas, the areas that are important to preserve. Now, in terms of our Indigenous Knowledge Program, there's three main purposes of it. It's to understand and gain insights by talking and mainly listening to community members and finding out what's important to them, areas of significance. We want to be able to identify potential effects, but if we don't know what's there, we can't identify potential effects. And as part of this program, we want to work with communities and talk to them and get their feedback in terms of and try to get that knowledge. And that knowledge is protected along the way as well, too. We will keep it confidential according to whatever conditions or regulations the community may set, because that's really important. And then we take that information and we try to identify impacts, and then we come back to the community to what you call validate. So check back with them and say, did we understand you correctly when you gave us this information from your community about important and significant sites? So that's a big program that we're doing right now. We're busy and we're looking for as much information as we can to feed it to into the environmental assessment. Now we get to consideration and evaluation of alternatives. So right now there's two alternative routes. The community has spent a lot of time and they have come up with a preferred route. And this was done over a number of years, internal community meetings. And so they came up with a preferred route, and then our technical team took that preferred route and then looked at it to see if we could maybe improve it slightly to allow it to sort of fit better with some of the technical realities, whether it's the soil types or just terrain types. And so we've done sort of a modified version of that. So we have basically two alternatives put together. And then so there's alternative routes, and then there's alternative locations for aggregated sources of rock or quarries. So we've got a number of those that we're looking at right now. We've done some sampling in various areas to try to identify where potential sources of gravel or rock that could be crushed into gravel or crushed into smaller rock that we can use for erosion control as well. So we've got a few sites for that. And on the screen here, you get an idea, I think, of how much material is required. So when you're looking at gravel, for example, you're talking about 129,700 dump trucks of gravel to build this road. And then rock would be required as well too, to protect culverts from erosion, and then fill, which is just basically dirt that has to be moved around to get the grades right for the road as well. So you can see the two alternative routes on the screen. Community preferred route is in yellow, and the green one doesn't really change much from that. It's more just trying to perfect it a bit in terms of just make it easier to build based on more on soil and terrain type. So when we evaluate the alternatives, we look at proposed criteria and indicators, so we go through that process. It's not just a simple process. We have to go through sort of a deep analysis when we're comparing these different alternatives as well too. And there's lots of factors involved. It's natural environment, indigenous knowledge, socioeconomic, cultural heritage, the technical side of things, the cost to build it as well too, how buildable it is, constructability. And then you're looking at the alternative that has the least effects, least negative effects, right? So there's a lot that goes into the evaluation of the alternatives. And then the evaluation of alternatives will consider other supportive infrastructure components, like I talked about, the temporary access roads to get to the temporary facilities, such as the gravel pits that might close down at the end of the project, the laydown and storage yards, trying to figure out where to put those to have the least amount of impact, because those temporary facilities, they have to be restored back to the way they were before, to the degree you can. So there's that part of it. So, consultation approach. So we are now finishing off the summer of 2022, and we're finishing off round one of the environmental assessment phase. So this open house is sort of right at the end of our consultation of round one. And next we're going to move into round two. In round two, we take the input from round one, we summarize it, we work with it, we try to refine the alternatives and start the evaluation of the alternatives as well too. We start, like I said, we start identifying that preferred route and start developing reasons for supporting that preferred route. And then we move into round three, which would be in the winter or spring of 2023. And so that would be taking round two, summarizing from round two. By that point, we'll have some preliminary impacts. We can summarize those for the various valued components. And at that point in round three, you start developing things called mitigation methods. And mitigation is another one of these environmental assessment words. It just means ways to reduce impacts. So that's where the thinking begins as to, okay, we know there will be negative effects when it comes to this, but how can we mitigate that? You may not be able to eliminate it, but how can you mitigate it? How could you make it less? And then as you're doing that, you're also identifying monitoring that might be required. So remember, a lot of people don't realize this, you know, there's monitoring that goes on. So the EA the environmental assessment goes through and looks at impacts, assesses impacts, identifies potential impacts. And then during construction, there's monitoring that goes on. There's an environmental management plan that occurs during construction that addresses all kinds of things, not just erosion and sediment control, but many other factors. And those factors, you know, can be determined by the input of community members as well too. So they can help shape that monitoring plan during the construction phase. And then after the construction phase, during operations, there's monitoring as well too. And in some cases, it may go for 5 years. In some cases, it may just go on forever. It might be regular monitoring when it comes to things like water quality or fisheries. And again, all that gets shaped by input from community members and the general public. So there's a lot coming up as we move ahead in this project. And then gathering feedback. So as I mentioned, we've been working with communities, and we've had chief and council meetings. We've had these open house type sessions. We've been communicating with communities through notices and newsletters and things like that. These live streaming like we're doing right now, radio shows as well. We've been doing interviews with specialists that are part of our team that are experts in certain areas. We've been doing interviews with them as part of the live streams to help community members understand the issues and what's important in environmental assessments. And so we've had discussions on building a road in peatland. You know, these are big topics that are important. So we'll bring in experts that know about this and talk to them about this and get a better understanding of how roads can be built in peatland to minimize impacts as well. We are also producing with each phase, with each round of consultation, a consultation report, like a summary report as well. And then consultation and engagement for all stakeholders of the public, so the broader public. Again, these notifications, the project website is a huge resource. There's a lot of information available on the project website. We have an email address. You can call us. Our door's always open. We're trying to communicate as much as possible. We want to be as transparent as possible about this environmental assessment to make it as comprehensive as possible as well too. So that's how we gather feedback, lots of different ways. And so right now, we're gathering input to finalize the criteria and indicators, the study areas for the valued components. We're continuing to wrap up the baseline studies. We're collecting Indigenous knowledge, and then coming up soon, we'll be evaluating those alternatives. We'll be finishing the preliminary engineering of the road, because we will have gathered enough information in order to be able to do that. And then in the winter, we'll start developing those preliminary effects, and then developing the mitigation and monitoring techniques as well too that might be necessary. And again, when I talk about mitigation, like limiting impacts and monitoring, you know, our team's already started developing ideas about this. But the more we learn about the project and the areas in the project, the more we can fine tune those different methods for limiting impacts to different areas. Certain areas like the peatlands require a certain amount of attention and more monitoring and more mitigation and different kinds of mitigations. So that sort of changes and gets more detailed as we move through the process. And then summer, fall 2023, there'll be the review of the final document, which is the document that goes to the provincial government and the federal government, the environmental assessment report and the impact statement as well. So we want to hear from you. As I mentioned before, we've got, you'll be hearing from us again soon, live in our radio shows, probably in a few weeks. And we'll be doing live streaming of those radio shows. And we're going to come up with some different topics. We're going to talk about some of the things that we've seen as part of our baseline studies, some of the interesting things that we've, observations we've made, so we can share that with you as well too. So there's a lot more to go coming up, and we want to hear from you as we do that. So I guess I'll open up to questions if anyone has any. Question? Yes.
I want to go more live for the. So just run the mic out to you, I guess. Can you hear me?
Oh, all right. Bonjour. I got a question going back to your 3 to 6 years, 75-year. Just wondering, just thinking out loud here. Has there been any consideration in upgrading this road from gravel because of maintenance issues with gravel roads and all that kind of stuff? Because you said this road might be there for forever. It's just to address, the maintenance costs. Has there been anything? I know we're not done, we're just starting here, but has there been any discussions around that? Because I like to ride home one day on a smooth ride.
You know what, a bumpy ride, eh? Not yet. But I think, we're still a ways away from that. There's a few questions that need to be answered, right? There's things like that. What's the final topping of the road going to be? I mean, right now it's gravel, but you know how these things can change over time depending on discussions. I mean, even before that, there's the fundamental question of ownership, right? And maintenance of the road too. That's a whole other issue that has to get sorted out first, right? And I see Roy Spence over there. I think he had his hand up.
Yeah, I want to say something before I fall asleep. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Roy Spence. I'm a First Nation member and a former Chief and Council member for 35 years. Anyway, we all did this, and we took our hard work, my colleagues and community members and elders, and the industry, government officials, MNR, MNDM, and Noron, former Noron, and all the mining exploration companies that were there back in 2001. We were work with him. Now our priority is to, as a community, to get the benefit from that development in our territory. So before that, I was directly negotiating with the former chief of Martin Falls, and he was kind of very political at that times, and he was my friend for many years, and I convinced him that this got to be done. Eh? So before that, we talk about the land use planning. All the plans has to be in place first, and all the plans, the community plans has to be in place, and the government has to be supported in community infrastructures as well. Eh? As you all know that, you hear the Premier of Ontario, and he described it as a prosperity road. So his focus was the road to the Ring of Fire, and this prosperity for the quality of life of the Northern Ontario people, Indigenous people. My question was this process is when our community members hear the process, the Ontario Environmental Assessment process, regulatory and policy process, we don't actually know what it is when they say there's a regulatory process from the legislation or policy. So that has to be defined when we do a community approach and community engagement process. We will have to draw a line or a picture, because as an Indigenous peoples, we want to see the physical of the presentations, like really meaningful process. As you all know that Indigenous people, we have a different signs or symbols of communication before. We draw on the snow when our partner behind us to move slow or to move fast. When you go after caribou or moose. So when our partner behind, a male behind us, and the hunter in lead in 1 mile ahead, you have to communicate your partner behind you that they're carrying your gear. You have to draw on the snow. You have to give him a sign. Once you see that, he'll move slow or fast. So these are the language symbols. Communication system has to be in the process. And today's as you all heard, every Indigenous community is in a crisis of drug addiction and alcohol, social issues and problems. We've been heavily involved for the last 40 years of our social problems. So it has not been fixed. We need to have our permanent structures and resources to deal with that at home. So we need, when he said that prosperity development, prosperity road, so he's going to have to come up to with the support to the communities of, especially those two communities that they push for this. Martin Falls First Nation, Webequid First Nation really push for this. While we have our brothers and sisters, surrounding communities challenge us. That is focus on that's going to destroy environment. Before we say that, we have to know what we're doing. We have to design something. So we have to learn how the structure, what kind of structure we're going to use, we're going to build to do that. And that cost, and what cost, and what resources, what experience, what experts we're going to need. So how are we going to train people, or better equipment, or better a better knowledge about what we want to do. And we have to make money. If we don't make money, it's no use having it. No use we have to make money. People that are going to do on the ground the job, they will have families that will need food on their table. I did that for years when I was trapping. I have a target, I have $15,000 annual income at least to get there. 15,000 was a lot of money at that time. 5,000 is the minimum. 15,000, I use that as a guide. And I have to have a snow machine, I have to have a border mower, I have to have shotguns and rifles and fish nets and even traps. But the MNR never give me a trap, not even one, to work for them, to work with their law, to harvest. They never give me a trap or snares, not even snowshoes. We're self-reliant. So that's what happened. So we, same thing is going to happen this. So we're going to have to, the community is going to have to make a decision on how they're going to benefit. We'll negotiate with the government and how the benefit businesses are going to be structured and to get benefit. We have to buy the planes. We have to buy trucks. We have to fix our infrastructure in the community, and we have to everything, whatever the human being needs, and that's what the people have to make money. Eh? So it's not good enough for someone to make $50,000 right now. So as I'm standing here, I retired from the council, so I never make that much, 50,000 a year. So I'm looking for a compensation from the government. Be good. 100 million at least. Thank you, Don.
Anyone else? No? I did. No other questions? Well, with that, we're going to stick around here. We're here till 9 o'clock. Feel free to look at the boards, have something to eat or drink, and we're around here to answer questions. And thanks for coming, by the way, too.
Yeah, we were